Exactly 50 years later, the same thing that most Israelis had sworn would never happen again did repeat itself with a new conception. Why did that happen? And why did Israel's military intelligence and political establishment ignore the threat from Hamas?
Well, you hit it right on the head. It was a classic textbook case of a concepcia. The best analogy I could think of is what happened in Munich at the Olympics in 1972. How could the Germans have left the Olympics completely unprotected to an attack by terrorists? And the answer is simple. It didn't occur to anybody that a bunch of terrorists would up and attack the Olympics. And if you had gone to the German security officials before and said, hey, there's a risk, they would have said, why on earth would someone do that? Wouldn't that hurt a terrorist cause? I mean, wouldn't that present them in a bad light? So it turns out when you're a terrorist, there's no bad publicity. Being a terrorist is never having to say you're sorry. All they care about is getting on the international agenda, and now we know that. What went wrong in 2023 was the Israelis figured that if they simply continue to supply Gaza, or as the saying goes, if it's good for them, it'll be good for us. Israel didn't have to supply Gaza, to be clear, because it was no longer occupying Gaza. Mm-hmm. True, under international law, when you are an occupier, when you are there, you have to assume responsibility for the health, safety, and well-being of the local population. But once you withdraw, that obligation goes away. So Israel had every right to just say, hey, you know what? We're done. But they didn't do that. They continued to supply Gaza, the thinking being, well, if it'll be good for them, it'll be good for us. They'll never cut off their only economic lifeline. They'll never blow up what we're giving them. They will never, in other words, sit down and commit an act of national suicide. Well, guess what? They commit an act of national suicide because we're finding out how jihadists think, which is, and look, Hamas leaders are coming right out and saying it, raise our kids, make a living. We don't care about that. We just want to commit genocide. So that's really what went wrong. That's really the whole story in a nutshell. Well, I mean, there's an issue of timing here.
Right.
And the reports are just now starting to come out. And I mean, like literally every week we're learning something new. In the most recent report, what they're saying is that Hamas was going to do this in 2022, but they could not get Hezbollah and Iran to join in, so they decided not to do it. But then in 2023, they took a cold, hard look at Israel and said, you know what? Israel is divided. Mm-hmm. They've got all this internal controversy. The pilots aren't showing up. This is going to be our best chance. So it does seem, initially it didn't seem this way, but now based on the intelligence that we're gathering, what happened was they found a computer, a laptop in the area where Sinwar was when he ran away. They're being a little coy. It's not clear if it's where he was killed or where he ran away earlier. If you saw that video of Sinwar going away with his wife and his 2 little kids or 3 kids, whatever it was, it's not clear which tunnel they found it in, but they found a laptop. And on the laptop were the protocols of a meeting of the war cabinet of Hamas. And in it, they found references that, look, this is going to be our best shot because right now, Israel's really divided. Now, what it really shows, though, is just like we don't understand them, they don't understand us. And they're finding out that the minute they do attack, all those divisions melted away and the Israeli people joined hands. And so far, they are, at least in my mind, winning a pretty extraordinary victory. Or like I say, there was a wonderful Jewish-American psychologist named Leon Festinger. And in the middle of the 20th century, he identified a phenomenon that he called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is a phenomenon when people have really deeply held beliefs, and then facts appear that contradict the beliefs. People change the facts. They don't change the beliefs. If you remember when we were all kids, the story of the emperor's new clothes, that was not written as a kid's story. That was actually written as a satire. And that's exactly what Hans Christian Andersen was satirizing. The king, when he goes out naked, the child screams, look, the king is naked. But the way the story ends, the original one is, the king was committed to this crazy position, so he continued walking through town with his sycophantic ministers holding the imaginary cape behind him. Barbara Tuchman, one of the most famous historians of the 20th century, wrote a classic called The March of Folly, where she basically said, look, cognitive dissonance is most found in matters of government policy. When government makes a mistake, it always doubles down. And that's just because the 2 things you need for cognitive dissonance are People are very invested in something, and there's another group of like-minded people to provide a support group when the whole thing blows up. The way to understand it in this context is real simple. Just engage in a thought experiment. Let's go back to the October 7 attack. 1,200 people murdered, 251 hostages, many, many women raped. The attack enjoyed universal support among the Palestinian people, as confirmed by every opinion poll. The Palestinians regularly refer to Jews as apes and pigs. One more fact. The Biden administration budgeted billions of dollars in aid to rebuild Gaza, even if they didn't sign a peace treaty. And they would say, let's be fair, not for Hamas, of course, but for the innocent civilians, what they term the innocent civilians. Okay, let's assume every one of those facts is true. Let's just change one fact. Let's assume the people of Gaza are Germans of another era, or white South Africans, or white supremacists. In other words, white people, not people of
all the most fashionable villains of our culture today.
Do you really think that the Biden administration would have budgeted billions of dollars for the white supremacist innocent civilians? And now hold the thought for a moment. Let's carry this all the way through. Let's assume again in this parallel universe, white supremacists, not Arab supremacists, but let's assume they murdered 1,200 black people and raped black women. And then they said blacks are apes and pigs. And then a Republican administration said, we want to help the poor, innocent civilians. And they budgeted billions of dollars to those innocent white supremacist civilians who say blacks are apes and pigs. They'd be rioting in the streets. People would go crazy. So the bottom line is what we have here is a classic textbook case of cognitive dissonance. There are a lot of people, and I mean serious people, really smart people, and they're just as susceptible to this phenomenon as everybody else. And they have a certain worldview, and their worldview is white people oppress people of color. And by the way, there's a lot of truth in that too. I'm not, the world is a complicated place. And if we were talking about, 1980s apartheid South Africa or Jim Crow, we'd probably find a lot more common ground than they maybe realize. But the point is, they look at this high profile conflict and it pits people of color, the Palestinians, against not just white people, but Jews, who in the minds of progressives are a white group of privilege. So you got the people of color in one corner and the white group of privilege in the other. They're backing the people of color. That's the way they're wired. The problem, of course, is the facts don't even remotely justify it. So they change the facts to fit the narrative. And that's what the book is all about. All the instances of cognitive dissonance where, for example, right after the attack, Barack Obama, very smart guy, very serious guy, he tweeted that we have to face facts. There's unclean hands on both sides. Why both sides? He said, because of what he termed the unbearable occupation of the Palestinians. Well, there was just one small problem. There was no occupation of the Palestinians. The Israelis had pulled out almost 20 years before. What was he talking about? I could give you countless other examples. I went on the search bar of Amnesty International, and I typed in the word rape. And this was in May of 2024. So by then, a number of Hamas terrorists had already admitted on camera that they had committed rape. A number of courageous Israeli women had stepped forward. There was a UN study that confirmed that rape had taken place. So you'd figure, they'd be there. Well, when I typed in rape on the Amnesty International search bar, 2,632 hits came back. Not a single one related to Israel. There was rape in Darfur, rape in Rwanda, rape in every corner of planet Earth, just not this. So I thought, well, that can't be. So I typed in Hamas rape. One entry came back. It was a Palestinian woman who claimed that the Israelis threatened to rape her. I mean, it's pretty obvious that, it's just cognitive dissonance. They can't bring themselves to back a white group of privilege against people of color, even when the facts are staring them straight in the face.
Yeah, I think part of this is also, ideology that has seeped into our education system, whether it's critical race theory, intersectionality, settler colonialism theory. All of this has indoctrinated, a new generation of Americans into this idea that the world is divided between, basically just two groups, the people of color who are always the victims and the quote unquote white oppressors who are always in the wrong and always doing terrible things. And they have defined, because it's sort of baked deep into the neo-Marxist origins of these theories, that Jews are white oppressors, even though, half or even a majority of Israelis are, by the definitions of the American left, people of color because they trace their origins in the Middle East or North Africa. And yeah, and that's played a major role in this too, hasn't it?
Well, first of all, to be clear, the term people of color is a misnomer. Only 32% of Israel's population are what you would call classically European white or Ashkenazi Jewish. However, when people talk about people of color, they're not talking about Sephardic Jews, okay? It's a misnomer. When people talk about minorities, they're not talking about American Jews. And then someone always says, well, what are we, a majority? Ha, ha, ha. Well, no, it's a misnomer. When people talk about anti-Semitism, the Arabs say, well, we can't be anti-Semites. We're also Semites. That's not what the term, it means hating Jews. Again, it's a misnomer. More to the point, you are correct, college campuses, but really only the elite ones. There was a guy named, I think, Mark Kotlikoff, who did a study. Most American campuses did not suffer from this, I'll call disease. It was only in the most elite colleges where this happened, Columbia most notably, but also Harvard, a bunch of others. But the point of the matter is, I decided if I was going to write a book and kill a lot of Sundays doing it, I wasn't going to waste a lot of time talking about college kids. It's a problem. It's a real problem. But I think the bigger problem, far bigger problem, are the serious people, the people who really should know better. Barack Obama, Jimmy Carter, Tom Friedman, the New York Times, Amnesty International. I mean, I could go on and on. That's really where our problem is. I think that's where we need to focus our attention.
Okay, well, I would push back at you and to say that these theories have seeped their way all the way through our American educational system, as many other studies and the work of people who really concentrate on this. K-12 schools are also involved in, ethnic studies, critical ethnic studies. This has seeped itself, it's not just Columbia and Harvard, it's throughout our country, and it's influencing much more. I mean, the New York Times 1619 Project. But let's get on to something else. One of the really interesting and I think original aspects of your deep dive into the reactions to October 7th is the way you trace these toxic myths about the Israelis and Palestinians back several decades to the policies of the late President Jimmy Carter and his post-presidency. In what way did Carter anticipate today's woke ideologues? And tell us how a territorial retreat that he forced on Israel directly impacted the October 7th attacks?
Okay, so first of all, we're still paying the price for Jimmy Carter's irrational hostility towards Israel. If you look at his post-presidency, he made peace with everybody, including Jimmy Carter. I mean, you got to give him credit. He lived by the Christian ethos that he preached. He made peace with Ronald Reagan. He even had some kind words for Donald Trump. The only country that he just had this irrational hostility that he took with him all the way to his grave was Israel. And a lot of people noticed this. I mean, he wrote a book, which is on the shelf behind me, called Israel, Peace, Not Apartheid. And I'm telling you, there is a misstatement of fact on practically every single page. It is comically awful. And a lot of people ask, like, what is behind all this? And the answer was that he grew up in the Jim Crow South. He said himself, when he first visited, he writes this in one of his books, that when he first visited Israel in 1973, he associated it with West Georgia, where his ancestors took land from the Indians. And by the way, the reason he was able to go into politics was he was independently wealthy because his family had a plantation that was stolen from the Indians and developed by enslaved Africans. So certainly, he had what to feel guilty about. But the fact is, this has nothing whatsoever to do with Israel. We don't have enough time for me to give you every difference, so I'll just focus on the big three. Number one, Jews are indigenous to what was called Palestine. There have been Jews in Palestine for as long as there is history. We even know the day they arrived. It was July the 14th, 1406 BCE, because the story of Joshua commanding the sun to stop in the sky was probably a solar eclipse. And there was a solar eclipse on that day, which fits perfectly in the timeline of Tanakh, the Bible. But anyway, the first difference is the Jews are indigenous. The second difference is, unlike the whites who came to America unannounced and uninvited, the Jews were invited to come to Palestine. They immigrated there legally. The Ottoman Turks invited them first because they wanted European know-how. And then the British invited them with an international consensus. And it was done, the consensus was it was a mandate for a Jewish state only if the immigration was done in a reasonable, measured fashion, which it was, which brings us to the biggest difference of all. Unlike the whites like Jimmy Carter, who stole the land and chased the Indians off and killed them, in Israel, The Jews bought the land. They paid for it. They bought it from the Palestinians themselves at exorbitant prices. Historians have looked at this. Swampland and desert in Palestine in the 1920s sold for 10 times per acre what fertile farmland sold for in Iowa and Nebraska. And I'm not blaming the Palestinian Arabs. I'd have done the same thing. We all know what makes real estate valuable: location, location, location. But, to sell the land, and all the leadership of the Palestinians of that era sold land to Jews. I mean, to having sold the land, what's the crime that the Jews commit? It's so ironic also that, or I could say paradoxical, that the very progressives who argue for immigration today are the very people who say, well, that immigration is, of the Jews to Palestine, that's illegal, that's immoral. And again, it speaks to the same thing. It's because the Jews are the white people, and the indigenous people, they think, who are not really indigenous to Palestinians, are the people of color. So immigration is a wonderful thing when it's people of color immigrating, but when it's white people, then they certainly have a problem with it. All of these problems with Jimmy Carter were felt at Camp David. Camp David did not happen because of Jimmy Carter. It happened despite Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is one of two American presidents, Barack Obama being the other, who took positions that were even more anti-Israel than the Arabs did. The big word in those days in peace process diplomacy was linkage. Everybody said that everything is linked to the Palestinian problem. Because the Palestinians wouldn't make peace, nothing could happen. Anwar Sadat said, I don't need a peace treaty with the Palestinians. I don't care. I just want Sinai back. So seemingly the road was wide open for a deal.
And to realign with the West and to get rid of the Soviets.
And the problem was Jimmy Carter kept saying, but I want a Palestinian state. Now think about what this means. Imagine you're sitting at a table with Russia and Ukraine both want a deal. And an American president says, well, but wait a minute. I want to see Russia first make other concessions with respect to, Georgia or something else. It's craziness. Why? You always want to shrink the conflict. Why would you make it harder, not easier? The deal did happen, but only because Menachem Begin essentially wouldn't budge. And so we have a deal. But there's even one other point, and that's the Jewish settlement of Yamit. That was the other sticking point.
Yeah, that's the point I wanted to get to as well.
Okay, so the Jewish settlement of Yamit, it's easier to find a map, was built right at the spot where Gaza borders the Sinai Peninsula. The Israelis built it because they foresaw a day when they would leave Gaza, and they wanted a buffer separating Sinai from Gaza to block the entry of weapons. So what could have been and should have been proposed was do a land swap. Let Israel keep Yamit next to Gaza and give the Egyptians some land, further south someplace else. It was the obvious solution, and it was proposed. Jimmy Carter rejected it out of hand. He wouldn't even hear of it. And so now here we are. We're still paying the price for his irrational hostility. None of this had to happen. In fact, what seems to be happening now, the Israelis have now created this Morag corridor just to the east of Rafah. They are probably going to depopulate Rafah and use that as the buffer to prevent the weapons from coming in instead. None of this had to happen. It all happened because of Jimmy Carter's irrational hostility. And when his aides were asked, why is he doing this? They all said the same thing. He associates the Arabs with the blacks and the Jews with the whites. And it's completely senseless.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I think
had this wonderful, I wouldn't say wonderful because a lot of innocent people were killed. I shouldn't use that word. But we had a perfect control group. You had two conflicts coming in a peace process at the exact same time. Northern Ireland and Israel. And both, I'm not going to say they were identical. No two conflicts are identical, but they were pretty close. Two conflicts that had been around for decades, seemingly intractable, with two different religious groups that had also morphed into nationalist groups fighting over the same piece of land. So in the case of Northern Ireland, they sent George Mitchell, then the Senate, formerly the Senate majority leader, and he acted as the intermediary, and he put down what was called the Mitchell Principles. The Mitchell Principles said no violence. Anyone who commits a single act of violence will not participate in the peace process under any circumstances, no matter what. And they kept to it. When the IRA commit violence, Sinn Féin was excluded from the talks. They never budged. There were some Protestant groups that did the same thing. They never wavered, and they ended up with a deal. Now, in the case of Israel, every time a bomb went off, Clinton would pressure Israel to keep making more concessions, because to back out would be giving the terrorists what they want, so went the argument, which is frankly ridiculous if you think about it. What made it all the more ridiculous was George Mitchell was sent in after Arafat started the Al-Aqsa Intifada, and he issued a report, and he put out a different set of Mitchell principles. And no one would believe it was the same George Mitchell, because when it came to Israel, he said, well, yeah, the bombs are going off, but you got to go back and negotiate. And by the way, the settlements are a problem. I mean, it's craziness. The only difference that I can see is Palestinians are people of color. And so people who are liberal identify with them on some level.
Yeah, and George Mitchell seemed to have his own, irrational hostility to Israel, as did Carter. Yeah.
And then you're touching upon the Israeli left. And this is the worst cognitive dissonance of all. They've got, very few people in politics have the courage and honesty to say, you know what, I made a mistake. This was just wrong. Imagine you're fighting for this cause your whole life, and the cause of the Israeli left, and you're like me, you're old enough to remember, but their argument was, look, the problem isn't the Palestinians. The problem is the Israelis. The problem isn't terrorism and rejectionism. It's settlements and occupation. And the settlements and the occupation, there'll be a peace deal. It turns out that's just wrong. This is something that almost never happens in politics. In ideology, you can actually prove wrong, because it turns out when you offer to dismantle the settlements and actually do dismantle them in Gaza, and when you do withdraw, you don't get peace. You get October 7th, you get suicide bombings. And still, despite everything, the Israeli left is still out there with all their crazy theories for why these things are happening. It's not because they made a mistake, of course. It's always Israel's fault. And that's why Benjamin Netanyahu is, I think, the most unfairly maligned politician on the face of the earth. They've always got some theory why it's really Netanyahu's fault. And just looking at it with any objectivity you can muster, it's perfect insanity.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. And then, you raised the point I just wanted to get to, is that what blinded Israeli left-wingers to the truth about the conflict, and what, to some extent, although most of the Israeli public has sort of rejected them, the Second Intifada sort of literally as well as figuratively blew up Oslo, the withdrawal from Gaza, and then the creation of a terrorist state, and then October 7th. Do you think we're seeing some of the same unwillingness to confront reality among those who are protesting the current government in Israel's determination to continue the war until Hamas is eradicated? Is this sort of an aftershock from the unwillingness which you talk about and write about the peace process with the Palestinians?
We absolutely are seeing it. It is complete irrationality. So the big argument of the Israeli left now, everything is Netanyahu, and they absolutely cannot stand him. He's reviled. Unfairly so in my view. But here's the big argument right now. So the people who want to get the hostages back, and of course we all want to get the hostages back, but there are some of us who think Israel should not put itself in a position where it's going to have to do this again in 10 years. And there are some, so here's what the people who are against Netanyahu are arguing. They're saying, okay, let's do the following. Let's do the deal to get the hostages back. We'll agree to end the war, but we all know Hamas is going to break the ceasefire at some point, and then Israel will just go back in and wipe them out. Now, because it's so obvious that Israel should do this, and because Netanyahu won't do it, it must be that Netanyahu won't do it because of political reasons. He only wants to stay in power. He knows if he does that deal, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich will leave, and his government will fall, and that's why he won't do the deal to save the hostages. He'd rather be in power than save the hostages, so say these people. Now, this argument is so nonsensical, I don't even understand how sensible people can say it with a straight face. First of all, let's just look at the evidence. By my count, in the year 2024, Benjamin Netanyahu put forth 7 different hostage proposals. Each time, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich said, if you do this deal, we will pull out and pull your government down. But he proposed it anyway. Now, Hamas turned him down every time, and that's why the government survived. And when they finally did the deal with Trump, the government would have fallen. It's just that he managed to convince Smotrich to stay by swearing they'd go back to war, which, by the way, he kept his word, and because he had Gideon Sa'ar. But the point is, He's shown a willingness to commit political suicide if he thinks it's in the country's interest. He did the same in the 1990s, by the way. Back then, the big issue was the White Plantation Agreement. And the right-wingers in his cabinet in those days said, if you sign this agreement, we will pull out and there will be elections. And that's exactly what happened. They brought the government down. There were elections, and Netanyahu was not doing well in the polls.